Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Sunday, April 7th. This is day 184. And normally on Sundays, I like to take a few minutes to try to reflect either on something from scripture or something related to what's happening in Gaza or the crisis there, of course, our efforts calling for a comprehensive ceasefire. And today I wanted to talk about a Jewish group that's based in the United States called Tru'ah. And their conversations about liberation. This week, I received a letter because I'm on Truah's mailing list. And I won't read the entirety of the letter, but I was very moved when I received this. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the courage that it's taken this Jewish group here in the United States to shift their position after the October 7th attacks by Hamas in southern Israel, that killed or resulted in the deaths of 1,200 people roughly, and more than 200 people being taken captive into Gaza. And I wanted to start by Trua Statement in mid-December, and they summarized what their position had been after October 7th. So they published a statement in mid-December, and it said, following Hamas's brutal attack on civilians in Israel on October 7th, Trua supported Israel's right to defend itself through military action, even while recognizing that a true end to conflict would require a political, not only military solution, and with the knowledge that the current Israeli government is composed of the same extremists against who we have been protesting for the last year. But we must be extremely clear, nothing can justify the level of death and destruction in Gaza. People of conscience must speak out, as Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote while protesting the Vietnam War. Our own integrity as human beings is decaying in the agony and merciless killing done in our name. Our position at Churches for Middle East Peace is we have been calling for a comprehensive ceasefire since October 7th. We believe that a military response and a violent response is not going to accomplish safety and security for Jews or liberation for Palestinians. But I wanted you to know where Truah was starting from, supporting a military solution in response to the October 7th attacks, but saying that that wasn't enough. But they went on in this December letter and said this war is unwinnable. As the war drags on, the number of reported Palestinian deaths surpasses 18,000. This is from mid-December, with 1.9 million people being displaced, rampant hunger and disease. The U.S. administration must demand that Netanyahu define Israel's military objectives and make clear that this war will end soon or lose U.S. support. Those military plans cannot include ongoing aerial bombardment in Gaza or depriving 2 million civilians of sufficient food, water, medicine, and fuel. For 2 months, the Israeli military has bombed civilian structures that they say are legitimate military targets, knowing that the human toll would be extremely high. While we recognize the ways in which Hamas has repeatedly endangered the lives of their own people, including through using civilian structures to house weapons and fighters, that does not excuse Israel or anyone else recklessly treating Palestinian civilians as collateral damage. And again, I'm not reading the whole letter, but I wanted to just include one more part from December. Again, this is Truah. They said, disarming Hamas is a necessary step towards a long-term political solution, recognizing that does not absolve us of our moral responsibility to call out all war crimes being committed in the conflict, including by Israel. The laws of war apply to all parties, regardless of who started the conflict. Hamas continues to commit war crimes by targeting civilians in Israel with rocket fire and refusing to release the remaining hostages. We are extremely concerned that Israel is also committing war crimes through indiscriminate bombing and by imposing collective punishment through a continuing siege of civilians in Gaza. Even when fighting in dense urban areas where Hamas is committing war crimes by using civilians as human shields or hiding in schools or hospitals, Israel is still obligated under the laws of war to minimize civilian casualties. I won't read any more of that, and certainly we don't agree with everything or much of what they've stated, but we do agree with some of what they stated. But I wanted you to know where they were starting from. In October and then in December, this is a Jewish human rights organization based here in the United States. And in December, their main point was they were calling on the U.S. administration to pressure Israel to return to the negotiating table immediately to achieve a ceasefire and to end the war as soon as possible. Truah voiced their support for an amendment to the president's spending bill that would require supplementary military aid to be used in compliance with U.S. and international law. Now, we've been talking about that a lot at Churches for Middle East Peace. The Security Memorandum 20 that mandates that U.S. military assistance be used according to U.S. law and international law. And this is the part that really moved me. After 6 months of war, and yes, you can say, why did it take so long? But I just would remind you, this is a population that, October 7th for them was deeply traumatic. And so I want you to see the shift in this organization and the shift in these rabbis and Jewish leaders. On March 8th, many of them, rabbis and leaders connected with Tru'ah and Tru'ah as an organization, sent a letter to President Biden calling for a bilateral ceasefire. And they talked about the number of casualties. They said, as they rise, we urge you to use the full force of America's leverage and global leadership to end the war. A ceasefire is the only reliable, proven means for securing the release of remaining hostages and ensuring the provision of desperately needed humanitarian relief to Gaza. Lives hang in the balance. There is no military solution to this conflict. An end to the fighting, though urgently needed, is not enough on its own to ensure the safety of Palestinians and Israelis for the long term. That is why we support your administration in taking clear steps towards establishing a Palestinian state. As this horrifying war continues, it's clearer than ever that the safety of the Jewish people and Palestinian people are bound up in each other. We long to see a truly democratic Jewish state, one that protects the human rights of every citizen alongside of an independent Palestinian state. Now, to you, this might not seem profound, but for many of these rabbis and leaders, honestly, calling for a comprehensive ceasefire, calling for what they're calling for, means taking great risks to themselves. And also, I think it takes moral courage. And they're also using leadership and risking ostracization from their own communities, which I see as a bold act of love, mercy, and justice. And this past week, this was the letter that I received from the head of Tru'ah, Rabbi Jill Jacobs. She sent out these words from the story of Exodus. She said this: the story of Exodus is on my mind. This week's news has made it clear that Israelis and Palestinians are still in the depths of Mitzrayim, the narrow place. The tragic killing of the 7 aid workers employed by World Central Kitchen is yet more evidence that Israel is not adhering to the laws of armed conflict and not doing anywhere near enough to protect civilians. People in Gaza are starving, with children and elderly among the most vulnerable to disease and death. And as aid organizations pull back due to the dangers, the situation will only get worse. Meanwhile, Hamas has rejected another ceasefire deal just as we reach the grim milestone of the hostages being held in captivity for 6 months. And the Netanyahu government is in no hurry to make additional compromises that might save the hostages' lives. This week, more than 100,000 Israelis, led by families of those hostages, protested outside of the Knesset because they understand the government is willing to sacrifice the hostages in order to prolong this war. Fears of attack by Hezbollah are also growing, and as of this writing, there are reports of rocket sirens in the north. We face the real possibility of a regional conflict that could be even more destructive and deadly. Trua continues to call on the U.S. government to use all possible leverage to achieve a negotiated bilateral ceasefire, the only means of securing the safe release of hostages, an influx of humanitarian aid in Gaza, and a speedy end to the war. We might hope that the week's horrifying events would be a turning point in the war, the 10th plague that forces the hands of leaders standing in the way of liberation. Yet, as Haaretz columnist Anshel Pfeffer points out, there have been many alleged turning points in this war. And then it doesn't happen. And a week later, you look back at these events and they're just a series of milestones, contours of a long war that just prove how impossible it is to predict how and when it will end. When will it end? When will liberation come? We will stand with the growing number of protesters in Israel who have run out of patience. Like biblical Nashon, they have stopped waiting for the miracle and they have decided to make one, taking to the streets to demand new elections and a hostage deal. In the Haggadah, we read, in each and every generation, a person must view themselves as though they personally left Egypt. Liberation is not only something that God did for our ancestors long ago, but a gift we have experienced firsthand. A Sephardic version of the Haggadah even renders this line as insisting that every person show themselves as having left Egypt. Our personal and communal experience of liberation propels us to take action, to seek the same for all oppressed peoples. And I invite you to bring this invitation to work for liberation for Palestinians and Israelis to your Seder. She talks about resources that Tru'ah has, like a downloadable Haggadah, and she continues, if you talk about the war at your Seder table or over the holiday with family, if that fills you with anxiety, you're not alone. The hazards of our time in this Mitzrayim are not only physical, but spiritual. Our hearts, like Pharaoh's, are at risk of hardening to the suffering we witness. While some have tried to justify Hamas's atrocities as legitimate resistance and the price of liberation, others have tried to excuse the Israeli Defense Forces' unconscionable disregard for the innocent life in Gaza as the unfortunate but unavoidable reality of war. This constant moral injury takes its toll. And she goes on to talk about being a strong, clear, moral voice, uplifting the humanity of both Israelis and Palestinians, demanding justice, demanding a real political solution that would protect the human rights of all people who live there, and of being together in the struggle for the liberation of all. Shabbat Shalom. Now, maybe it's quite contentious that I'm reading this to you. I mean, as I mentioned, our positions are quite different. We don't call what's happening in Gaza a war. We call it an ethnic cleansing. And many of us, we are committed to the prevention of further genocide. Many of our member communions have called it genocide, and the International Court of Justice has said it very well could be. But I wanted to highlight for you the shift and move of a human rights group that started at a very different place, supporting militarization and feeling like it was a necessary component, and now saying enough is enough. Now, maybe they're saying it softly, and maybe they're saying it differently than I would or you would, but may God go before us. And there was so much in the language that was written there about our liberation being tied up in one another that I think is profound and true. So might we reflect on those things as we seek solidarity and working in partnership, even sometimes when we don't see eye to eye, but working to an end to violence, an end to all killing, an end to all death and destruction, as we seek an end to oppression, and as we seek peace and a way forward together.